Hello, everybody, and welcome to How to Read the Bible. Today, we are going to start talking about what is my favorite book of the Bible, the book of Exodus. It'll be two parts. The first part is going to be chapters 1 through 18, which read more so like a story, more like what we're used to in reading in Genesis. And then the last part of the Exodus story of the book of Exodus, chapters 19 through 40, will have story elements kind of interspersed in there, but it also contains things like the Ten Commandments and several other laws and instructions for constructing the tabernacle. So we're going to get into that portion next week, but today we're going to focus on chapters 1 through 18. So let's get started. Chapters 1 through 18, I entitle The Exodus Event. And you might be thinking to yourself, how creative, Austin, calling the Exodus. Um, Innovative and creative as I am, that's just exactly what it is. The reason we call the book of Exodus is not because of what happens in the entire book of the Exodus, but or in the entire book of Exodus, but because of what happens, especially in the first 15 chapters. Uh, that is that tells us of the liberation of the people of Israel from Egypt. They exit Egypt in these chapters. And it is a grand exodus from their slavery into a new reality, into a new relationship with Yahweh, with the Lord. And that's what the rest of Exodus starts talking about is what does this new life look like on the other side of this freedom? But the first 18 verse or sorry the first 18 chapters talk about their time in slavery, their freedom, Moses's call to be God's instrument through which God frees the people of Israel from Pharaoh and from Egypt. But first, let's talk a little bit about the background here. I don't know if you can see very well on this picture. It's not a great picture because I just took a picture with my phone of the book that I was reading, um, the Old Testament book that I've been studying and using as a resource. And so this is probably the most simple and kind of direct picture of the journey of the Israelites out of Egypt. They go out of Ramesses into Succoth and through the desert to what is thought to be the location for Mount Sinai. Um, as with most things in the Old Testament, we don't get a real, detailed record of the expedition. We don't know exactly where Mount Sinai is, but that is what's thought to be the location of Mount Sinai, where it is thought that the people went based on biblical records. It's most likely that the Israelites lived in relative freedom in Egypt. When we leave the story in Genesis, they're living in Egypt not as slaves, but as fellow residents. They're not entirely just their own people. I mean, they're living in Egypt or next to Egypt. They're living um, under Egyptian care. They're getting grain and food from the Egyptians. So they're kind of living next door to this more powerful nation. So they live in relative freedom because of the good relationship that they have based on Pharaoh's relationship with uh, Joseph. And I want to make a correction from a previous video. I think I confused the names of the possible pharaohs for uh, the Exodus story and who the Pharaoh was possibly in Joseph's time in Egypt. Um, but the Israelites lived in Egypt probably from around 1700 BC to the reign of Pharaoh Seti the First. And it's thought that this Pharaoh is the one that put them into slavery and into captivity and into work uh, for for his construction project, for his establishment of Avaris as his capital to keep control over, um, and his control over Canaan and Syria. Seti is thought to be the Pharaoh that put the Israelites into slavery. And there's a reason for this. And the reason that is talked about is the one in the Bible, that the Israelites stay a long time in Egypt and they grow large, they flourish, they are fruitful and multiply. And Pharaoh grows anxious that this flourishing people is next door, and they're not really doing anything to keep check on their rise to possible power. So, out of this anxiety of the Israelites possibly taking over his power, which we don't really have an indication whether or not that was even a possibility or not, but Pharaoh certainly thinks that it's a possibility. So he puts them into slavery. And when they continue to flourish, even under slavery, this Pharaoh commits infanticide. Um, in other words, he has the newborn uh, sons of Israel killed in order to sustain his own power, to keep them from multiplying. The Pharaoh that confronts Moses, the Pharaoh that we read the most about in the book of Exodus, is probably Pharaoh Seti's son, Ramesses II. Moses kills an Egyptian slave master and runs into a kind of exile to avoid punishment from this Pharaoh. And God later lets Moses know that Pharaoh that was seeking his life has died, and his son is now the Pharaoh. So Moses, when we see Moses go and say, "Let my people go," and the plagues and all of the Red Sea events, this Pharaoh is likely Ramesses II. And the date for the Exodus event, the crossing of the Red Sea, the leaving of Egypt after the 10th plague, that likely happened around 1280 BC. Again, just to point out, these are approximate dates because the book of Exodus doesn't really want you to be that concerned about the date. Nor is the book of Exodus really that concerned that you know who Pharaoh is. But these are things to help us understand and help us envision and understand the situation better. Here's the structure of chapters 1 through 18. We begin with Israel's bondage in Egypt. A new Pharaoh, one that does not know Joseph, comes into power and brings enslavement for the Israelites. This Pharaoh also kills the children of those Israelites, and one of those children is saved by his family. His name is Moses, and Moses' mother and his sister take him and just let the Nile sweep him down to safety. Hopefully, it's really a move of trust. It's really a chance that they take. As you know, rivers are not always safe havens. They're not. They're definitely not when there are crocodiles around. But Pharaoh's daughter finds this child in a basket and takes him in. But Moses kind of knows he's Israelite, or sees the Israelites being enslaved and mistreated later in his life as he branches out and as he gets to know his own people and sees how they're mistreated. He kills a slave master. One of those slave masters is beating severely or whipping a fellow Israelite, and Moses kills him. Something that is not necessarily an action that is condoned, but it is an action that Moses takes nonetheless, an option that Moses takes. He takes matters into his own hands. And later he kind of hears that Pharaoh's looking for whoever killed this man. So he leaves. He goes into Midian. He goes and becomes a shepherd. He gets married. He lives life. But then um, God hears the people's cries. Presumably, God has heard the people's cries this entire time. But God appears to Moses in a burning bush, a bush that is burning, but it's not consumed. And this sight kind of intrigues Moses, so he goes up onto the hillside um, of this mountain, or onto the side of this mountain, and God speaks to him and says and commissions him to go and set the people free. And Moses and God have a long conversation. Moses doesn't feel equipped for the task. He comes up with excuse after excuse. What if Pharaoh says this? What if the Israelites say this? What about the fact that I can't really speak eloquently? Can't Aaron come along? And God kind of gives in reluctantly to Moses's plan to bring Aaron, his brother, on um, as a more eloquent speaker where Moses is not. But then Moses goes and he and Aaron confront Pharaoh. Moses confronts Pharaoh in the Lord's name. Moses asks if the people can be allowed to go worship God in the wilderness. Pharaoh, who does not know the Lord, that's an important phrase that will come into play later, or that we'll examine. Pharaoh, who does not know the Lord, responds by making slavery harder, almost to say, you want to be free? Well, too bad. I'm going to make things harder for you since you asked. God responds then with plagues. And Pharaoh's heart, that's meant to say heart there, Pharaoh's heart is hardened. Now, this is um, an interesting part here. Pharaoh's heart is hardened by either Pharaoh or the Lord, depending on which time Pharaoh's heart is hardened. There's 10 plagues, and each time, um, increasingly, Pharaoh's heart is hardened by himself, and increasingly, the Lord hardens his heart. So some theologians will go at this and say, this is an example of free will and free choice in creation, that Pharaoh is able to decide to harden his own heart, to be hardened to this. But others will come and say, no, this is an argument for predestination, that God decides. And what we have to wrestle with is that there are both those things there. Pharaoh is both hardened by his own volition, his own choice, and he's hardened by the Lord, who I think the best way to maybe think about this is that Pharaoh gets to a point where he's beyond sort of the point of no return. His heart is hardened to the point that God just continues him down the path he's already on, a path that he has gone so far down that he can't turn back from. Well, while that's a hard thing to wrestle with and a hard thing to talk about, because there are both of those two things there, God hardening Pharaoh's heart and Pharaoh hardening Pharaoh's heart, it's important to see that, to pay attention to who's doing what. Exodus 12 is where things start to turn toward the Israelites' favor. The final plague is a plague of death. And much like every other plague, it does not affect the Israelites. This is the only plague, though, that the Israelites have to indicate that they are Israelites. They paint blood on their doors to signify that they are indeed Israelites. They are indeed Israel's family, Moses's people, so that death passes over them, and death claims the firstborn of Egypt's children. You might recall, though, that Pharaoh has done that to Israel's children. So this is a hard story, though. This is not I'm not passing that over as a hard thing to wrestle with, but it is significant because it shows how costly this freedom is, how deeply entrenched and hurtful and harmful to all parties Pharaoh's oppression is. It's not just affecting the Israelites; it's affecting his own people. Death is the result of this kind of oppression. And so the final plague is death, which passes over the Israelites. And that's why they call the holy day, the holy season, Passover, because death passed over the Israelites. And Pharaoh finally gives in. Pharaoh says, "Take your people, get out of here." And so they go. But Pharaoh hardens his heart and he pursues them all the way um, to the Sea of Reeds, or this Red Sea. It can be interpreted both ways, the Sea of Reeds or the Red Sea. And God parts the waters and they pass through, and the waters come crashing in on Pharaoh and on Pharaoh's troops. One of the things that, if you've ever seen The Prince of Egypt, one of the things that is different from that movie and from the Exodus is that in that movie, Pharaoh survives. He gets tossed out of the water, um, mostly so that the audience can see that he has recognized his own wrongs. But in the scriptures, Pharaoh never really gives in that way. Never comes to an understanding or a recognition or a repentance. Pharaoh is crushed underneath the waves. From there, the Israelites worship the Lord who has set them free, who has um, crushed their oppression underneath the waves. And they go into the wilderness and they are guided and sustained by God. God leads them by day and by night. God feeds them all along the way. And it is this journey that will take them to Sinai and take them into a new reality of being God's people. Now, it should be noted that all throughout this entire story, all throughout the whole story of Genesis from Abraham on, these are God's people. But the Exodus event brings them into a new covenant with the Lord. And we'll pick up on that next week. But it should be stated that though there is a covenant coming, God has already claimed these people. And that shows that through these actions of freedom. A few words about characters and themes. Yahweh, the Lord. Um, just a quick note, if you ever notice in your Bible when it says like the Lord and it's all capital letters, it is the name of the what's called the tetragrammaton, the four letters, the Yahweh in Hebrew. And Yahweh, the particular God of Israel, is the primary character of this story, bar none. God hears the people's cries. God is dedicated to liberating them through Moses. God works with Moses and Moses's demands and anxieties. God um, works to bring them out and accomplish that, and is dedicated to this relationship with these particular people and with this particular man named Moses, who is his instrument through whom he will free them from Egypt. But it's important, even though we recognize Moses and we understand him to be a very important character, it is God working in and through him and amongst the Israelites that is the main thrust of Exodus. In this text, it's important to notice that we don't know Pharaoh's name. Yes, we get to kind of conjecture about it. We get to say Ramesses II is probably the guy, but the Bible never says. Why? Because it's not important that you know Pharaoh's name. The most important man for his day in that entire region, in the entire Middle East, ancient Near East, he is the guy, but we don't know his name in the scriptures. We do know other people's names. For example, we know Shiphrah and Puah, who are two midwives who save some of the babies that Pharaoh is trying to kill and lie to Pharaoh's face. They save children from Pharaoh's oppression, and we know their names, but we don't know Pharaoh's. That says more than I could ever say. We know their names. We know the name of one of the babies he tried to kill, named Moses. We know the names of, I believe we know the names of Moses' mother and his sister and his brother. And we know these Israelites, but we do not know this Pharaoh. He is not named, he is not worthy to be named because he has oppressed. Can you tell I love this? Moses acts as an ambassador for the Lord. Now we get to Moses. Even though Aaron speaks for him, he is God's ambassador. Aaron speaks for him as an extension of his voice, but Moses speaks as an extension of God's voice. So God is at work in through the words and actions of Moses. And the staff is interesting. It kind of is symbolic of the finger of God held by Moses. God tells Moses what to do with it, and God points and touches things or holds it in the air, and things happen. Let's talk about some of those things that God does, and some of the important ways that this relationship with God at work in this story affects how we read the story and some of the things that we discover about who God is and what God is up to. One important thing is knowledge and worship of the Lord affects the integrity of the created order and human relationships. Because Pharaoh doesn't know Joseph, he enslaves the Israelites. When asked about freeing them, his first sentence is, I don't know this Yahweh. I don't know you or this God. And that's clear by Pharaoh's actions. He does not know. He does not know Joseph. He does not know the Lord. And that translates over to how he treats others, how he sees himself. He sees himself as God, not this God of his slaves. Yahweh's actions are not only to free Israel then, but they're also so that Egypt might know. The Lord says explicitly to Moses that God's purpose is not here just to let Israel know he's on their side, but so that Egypt might know the Lord, where Pharaoh doesn't. All of Egypt, all of Pharaoh's people, even Pharaoh himself might come to know who the Lord is. And in liberation, in this freedom, in this Passover, God calls the people of Israel to remember through ritual practice, through storytelling. We get a very detailed, probably later added account, or something that was probably later added into the book of Exodus. This detailed ritual of the Passover meal and a Passover celebration, all so that Israel can remember this, that God is the Lord who freed you from Egypt. That is an essential phrase, I think, for us to learn and for us to kind of mark down in our Bibles maybe when it happens. I am the Lord who freed you from Egypt. We will see that again. So pay attention to that phrase, because God will want to remind Israel, and Israel will forget time and time again that God is the Lord who freed them from Egypt. And it's not very long until they start to forget that. Israel will, in their wilderness wandering, when they get hungry, when they get thirsty, when they lose hope, they will start to remember their slavery positively, not negatively. They will remember that they were slaves in Egypt and had food, and slaves in Egypt and they had water, and slaves in Egypt and at least they were alive, but they forget that the Lord freed them for a reason. So this knowledge, this remembrance, and this worship of the Lord affects the integrity of human relationships between God and between each other. The Israelites will struggle with remembering this fact at the peril of becoming what they were freed from. And finally, we have creation and liberation as themes here. God hears the cries of God's oppressed people, showcasing that God's compassion for the lowly, for the enslaved, for the oppressed is intense. especially for these particular Israelites. God works through human beings then also to extend God's work of salvation. God doesn't just seek the freedom of Israel, but the freedom of Israel through other people, through Moses going to Pharaoh and working and speaking on God's behalf. God is dedicated to work with human beings, to speak life through them. And humanity is not created to do these things that Pharaoh's doing. God put humanity there to govern as God would, but the actions of Pharaoh are totally against that. Pharaoh does not love as God loves, does not govern as God would govern. This is showcased in the very beginning of Exodus. Israel fulfills God's commands. They are fruitful, they multiply. And Pharaoh quite literally seeks to reverse that. To not make them fruitful, he makes them slaves. To not make them multiply, he kills their children. The Israelites are fulfilling the commandment to human beings in creation, and Pharaoh is trying to snuff it out, and God will not stand for it. So God intervenes, and God furthers Pharaoh's own deconstruction of God's intentions. The plagues are a kind of deconstruction of creation. This is, if you've ever wondered, like, what in the world are these plagues about? Think about this. Exodus is not on an island on its own. It has Genesis in the background. The plagues are a kind of reversal of creation. Pharaoh is trying to reverse God's created order. So God says, fine, have it your way. We will reverse the created order. God starts with the animals. The animals get sick. The flies come, the frogs, the food chain is out of order. The animals get sick, the human beings get sick, people get boils. It moves on to the it moves all the way to darkness, where creation started with light. The plagues end in darkness. Where the creation started with life, the plagues end in death. And there is no greater picture than the Red Sea parting itself. Just as God separated the waters above and the waters below in creation, God separates these waters and makes dry ground appear in the waters. He doesn't make it appear, he just pushes those waters aside and there's dry ground. He separates the waters and dry ground is there from the land and the sea. And the Israelites walk through and are a new creation on the other side. And upon Pharaoh and his armies and all of the intentions of evil to undo God's creation, God crashes that water down, undoing them in their chaos by chaos itself. The freedom of Israel is a new creation. It comes at great cost, and it's hard fought, and it's not cheap grace, but they emerge as a new creation, and will be given a relationship with the Lord unlike no other. I look forward to talking to you about that covenant, about the Ten Commandments, about the tabernacle, and about the ways that God furthers this relationship with these people as want to forget as they are. But thank you for joining me in this examination of Exodus 1 through 18. I am so excited to talk to you about it because it is my favorite story, and I hope that you get to read it too. I hope you read all 40 chapters of Exodus and all for all that it's worth, and I hope this is an inspiration to you. If you haven't been doing so, like, comment, subscribe so that you can get more of these videos, so that you can see more of what we do. Thank you for joining us today. Have a blessed week.